So as we talk about the land plants, we're going to see that they have a different life cycle than you might be familiar with by studying animals. So before we get into the land plant life cycle, just want to give you a generalized life cycle. This is basically the sexual reproduction life cycle. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, at least on a cellular level, this involves the fusion of two cells in a process called fertilization. So in the human example, this would be a sperm cell and an egg cell get together. Each of them has half of the full number of chromosomes, what we call a haploid set. So basically one copy of every distinct kind of chromosome. And this one copy and one copy, they fuse together into a single cell that then has two copies. We call it diploid, and we use this notation 2N. So two sets of chromosomes in diploid individuals. So in humans, this would be sperm and egg cell fused together to create a zygote, and that zygote grows up by cell division or mitosis into the young and then adult human. And to continue the cycle, the human has to generate a new round of gametes. So through the process of meiosis, that human can make new sperm cells, new egg cells, and then they fuse again. So it's a process of going between this double number, the diploid number of chromosomes, back to the single number, the haploid number of chromosomes. And this is something we see throughout organisms. It's present in fungi and plants and animals with variations throughout, but it's a very common process, and it's one that is really handy if you study this in an evolutionary context. This has been a major source of variation that fuels evolution and adaptation. All right, so this is kind of the generalized version, haploid phase, diploid phase, the process of meiosis and fertilization. All the terms that are on here are applicable to any organism that's doing this sexual reproduction. So just a little refresher of animals. Now I've got a little bit of a different size here, showing you an increase in size up till this multicellular diploid animal that then can undergo meiosis. So in animals, there's a little more emphasis on the diploid phase, right? So you go through your whole life. You started as one cell, you go through a very long life, and only when it's time to do sexual reproduction do your cells, as a result of meiosis, do they go through fertilization, right? So this is a very small portion of time, the time when one egg cell is really called up to the big time. One egg cell, one sperm cell, they get together. Really rare event, really brief event in the scheme of a whole organism's life. And that's not always the case, that the haploid phase is such a small portion of life. Just another illustration here. So gametes referring to sperm cell or egg cell. This diploid multicellular individual would be the young all the way up through adult versions of whatever you got there. All right, so if we're going to look at the land plant life cycle, I think it's helpful to contrast the green algae life cycle. And the green algae life cycle does not have hardly any time spent in the diploid phase. So this is kind of a new way, or a different way to do things, really just flipped from how the animals do it. So animals have the dominant diploid phase. Most of their life is diploid, and only brief haploid phase. And in the green algae, the diploid phase is very brief, and the haploid phase can be rather extensive. So we can have multicellular haploid individuals, as in this freshwater macroalga, one that you can see with your naked eye, or these microalgae, which you would need to see under a microscope to see their cells. And that's all the investment in the haploid phase. So when they go through sexual reproduction, it's kind of a brief devotion to specialized cells that are their gametes. Those gametes fuse, they make a zygote, and that zygote, really the next thing it does, it doesn't divide, but it doesn't divide in mitosis, but it goes through meiosis and generates haploid cells again. So this part is very brief. So there are different ways to do life cycles. Here's maybe a better illustration with some actual cells on it. This is a kind of a model algae study organism called Chlamydomonas. And it has single-celled throughout. and it has a haploid phase where there are sort of like male and female versions here. So they get this plus and minus designation, and then they go through their plus and minus life. And when it comes time to do fertilization, sort of specialized versions of those plus and minus cells get together. So plus finds minus, they fuse together, so they're joining together, and then they fuse their cytoplasm, and they become a diploid plus minus individual. And again, that cell doesn't get any bigger, it doesn't go through mitosis. It exists here, might firm up into this zygospore, but ultimately it undergoes meiosis and then generates more of those haploid cells here. So a little bit less exciting, I guess. This is a diagram showing just really single cells throughout, but showing emphasis across this dotted line, emphasis on haploid phase or diploid phase. And here you can even see the diploid phase is pretty small there. All right, another way to look at this is one of those macroalgae. Same thing, the large part that you can see with your naked eye, that is the alga, that is haploid. And on it, it produces eggs. So this is an egg container called an oogonium. This is a sperm container called an antheridium. So the same plant produces, same algae, I should say, produces sperm and egg. And those sperm cells swim out in the fresh water. This is a video I got from the internet. Link below if you want to watch the bigger versions of these. And the sperm cells, this kind of corkscrewy thing, goes through the medium. It's going to find its way into this kind of open part. So this part here on the right image is the same structure as this part here on the left image, so a little bit of context there. So that's the entry port for sperm cells to access this egg cell that's in here. So egg in here, sperm going this way. And then just a little note, that part there is not actually part of the algae. That's a conveniently placed rotifer. All right, so moving from, if we think of green algae as the closest living relatives to land plants, then we can kind of use them also as a point of comparison. So green algae, they were capable of being multicellular. They were living in fresh water, so not really making it up onto land, certainly not as large structures. So moving into land plants, there were some adaptations that had to come about. So nice illustration here. This is a big carpet of moss, including some moss reproductive structures there. And this is maybe the kind of environment you might have seen the early plants inhabiting. So moist, plants growing low to the ground, and probably very densely because there wasn't a lot to compete with. All right, so what we get in contrast to the algae, we didn't see before this multicellular diploid phase. In the early land plants, and now in all of our land plants, the diploid phase is multicellular. So it becomes multicellular. And in some organisms, like the seed plants, this diploid phase is actually dominant. Seed plants and ferns, I should say. All the vascular plants have more of a dominant diploid phase. If they're moving out onto land, they need to be able to live without drying out. And so this is where we see, as this transition happened in the early land plants, the evolution, the adaptation of this covering over the plant that keeps it from drying out. So the skin or the epidermis, we're going to see modifications to the epidermis that keep it wet, keep the cells inside wet and protected from the outside. Not something we see in the green algae also. We'll talk about spores. Spores are going to be an important life cycle phase for the early land plants. And this was a phase that would be able to resist drying out. So I guess for now, you can kind of think of them like seeds. So if you have a drought and everything is ruined, all the living plants, all the green parts of the plants die off, that plant species can stay alive because it's got some seeds packed up in hard containers that they don't mind so much being dry. Spores did the same thing for the early land plants. They still do the same thing for the seedless plants. They all reproduce using spores. And spore is a single cell that has a hard coating that resists drying out, resists actually being eaten even. And that was an important adaptation to living on land. So you want to keep yourself from drying out. It might be that the green parts of plants die and dry out, but if the spores are there, they can handle dry seasons or unfavorable placements or whatever, kind of hold on until conditions get better. That's an important part of being a plant. Obviously, if you're a plant, you can't really move away from bad conditions. So if you end up in the sun, you are totally hosed unless you can get some part of you to survive that. Something we'll see in a little more detail is kind of related to these other features. The embryo is the first part of the diploid phase that is multicellular. So there's sort of this diploid dividing and becoming multicellular, and it becomes this embryo, and as it develops into the embryo, it actually receives nutrients from the parent plant. So the egg parent is packing nutrients into the developing diploid individual, and that becomes the embryo. And this nourishment is also important if you think about living in a dry, harsh environment. When you make a zygote, you make this new organism that starts off as one juicy diploid cell, it might not make it on its own very well, needs a little bit of a head start. So in the head start, it gets some nutrients from the egg parent, I guess you could call it the female parent, get some nutrients to help it development, and get some protection, also some moisture, and that allows it to get a head start for the next part of its life. All right, so this is from one of your textbooks. This is the life cycle of land plants. So if we leave the green algae behind, this life cycle is going to apply to all of the land plants. So kind of convenient. You might have learned this before, and I think it's important enough that we should learn it in this class. Even though it's full of terminology, it's not so intuitive if you don't think about life cycles very much. But we're going to use the terminology here, and I think it's important to kind of place where these terms fit in the life cycles of these different land plants. So let's see, I started with spores. We could talk about spores. So spore is this single haploid cell, which is the immediate product, I should say, the immediate product of meiosis. So after the diploid cell, this one designated cell, it's called the spore mother cell, after it goes through meiosis, it generates 4 cells, as we've seen before in meiosis, right? And those 4 cells are spores. If they need to, they can hole up and stay safe while the environment dries around them. That's also, their size is also really good for getting around. So spores are able to blow around in the breeze because they're so small and compact. Now in land plants, the spores grow up into multicellular phases. So we've got this plus and minus notation again, kind of substituting in for male and female. Plus version grows up into one kind of what we call a gametophyte. So gametophyte is a multicellular haploid organism. 2 kinds of gametophytes, and for them to generate gametes, requires them to designate a special cell. So they're already a bunch of haploid cells. They don't have to go through meiosis to make the gametes. They're already haploid. So instead they just designate certain cells to become sperm cells or egg cells. So we got sperm cells from one kind, egg cells from another kind, and those fuse together, as we've seen before, fertilization. Product is a zygote, and then grows up into the diploid multicellular life cycle phase, which is called the sporophyte. So most of what's on here we've seen before. So we've seen gamete, we've seen fertilization, we've seen zygote, we've seen diploid, we've seen meiosis. So maybe a little over half of the terms on here are ones you've seen from the other life cycles. So we're just adding on a special term for the multicellular diploid, sporophyte, and a special term for the multicellular haploid, gametophyte. Those can be a little confusing if you're just learning them, remembering which is gametophyte and which one's sporophyte. That can be a little tricky. So the gametophyte makes gametes, and because it makes gametes and you understand the life cycle, you would know that the gametophyte is haploid. The sporophyte makes spores, and makes spores through the process of meiosis. So the sporophyte is diploid, and actually the spores are haploid, right? It's going to take some practice. So practice this, use the terms, we'll put some quiz questions on. You can practice quizzing yourself on this one. Another way to look at this, so using the imagery that I had before, if you want to compare this to what you know about the human life cycle, we're basically taking what's present in the animal life cycle and adding on a multicellular haploid phase. So this is like after meiosis, instead of making a sperm cell, you make a multicellular sperm organism or a multicellular egg organism that then later makes sperm or egg cells. So it's sort of the addition of this multicellular haploid phase that really distinguishes this from the animal life cycle. All right, so we're going to put some, we'll be able to point to parts of plants and say this is sporophyte, this is gametophyte, and I think that'll help you understand what's going on with the life cycle. Again, it's not terribly intuitive, but it's important to understanding how plants work, so we will be covering it. All right, so how do plants do what they do? I don't know. If plants watched a dirty movie, would they watch this? Who knows?